Hey guys. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a picture review packet over the 20s and 30s. You ready? Let's go. So first we're going to start with POTUS, President of the United States, in case you didn't know what that stood for. And we're going to start with our first one. He gets elected in 1920, and that's going to be Harding, like Heart Ink, Harding. Okay? And what Harding gets elected on, he gets elected on this idea of wanting to time travel back in time, which is why we have a time machine, to return to normalcy. And he wasn't kidding about that, because returning to normalcy meant he was returning to political corruption, most notably, the Teapot Dome scandal. In case you forgot what the Teapot Dome scandal is all about, that's when Albert Fall decided to lease out publicly owned lands that had oil in them to private businesses and then pocketed the money. Now what happens is Harding is so just beat up by all this political corruption in his cabinet that he goes on a speaking tour and he dies. But his presidency begins the reign of the Republicans, and Republicans will be in office for 10 more years after Harding dies. But then Hoover and the Great Depression happen. And suddenly, everyone's all about the Roosevelt. And when Roosevelt gets elected in 1932, he starts making major changes just within his first 100 days. And one of the things he does, one of the first things he does, is he enacts a bank holiday. So this is the bank on vacation, on holiday. Okay. Now in the 20s, we have some major changes that are happening. So we just talked about some political issues, some political changes in the 20s. But let's talk about some social changes. So in art, we have major social changes will create an impact on art. So one of those social changes is going to be the Great Migration. So that's a cheese grater, in case you didn't know. But migration. And with that huge population shift, a lot of African Americans are going to move north, and they're going to bring their sounds and their lifestyles. So the Great Migration is directly tied to the creation of jazz, and the Harlem Renaissance. women, the changing role of women, changing role women, will lead to not only social changes, not only in fashion changes, because here we have flappers of the 20s. They show leg, they cut their hair, they smoke, they drink, right? They're in urban centers, they're getting jobs, they're getting educations, they're getting an education. Sorry. But they're also creating and being recognized for the art that they're creating. One of the most notable female artists of the time is going to be Georgia O'Keeffe, who really paints about gender roles. So she paints a lot of flowers and skyscrapers. Okay? And we've talked about what both of those things symbolize. Alright. So more in the 20s. More social changes happening in the 20s. Some of the social changes are not always good. Major intolerances that occurred during the 1920s. The first one I want to talk about is nativism. Okay? And nativism is the idea that Native Americans, and I don't mean these actual Native Americans, I mean people whose families have been here a long time, or they were born in America, but they become very xenophobic. They want to they become anti-immigrant, and that's going to manifest in a few different ways. Okay, so one of the ways that it manifests is the Palmer Raids, which essentially boot out any communists and other radical ideologies. Okay? Second way it manifests itself is going to be quota acts, which basically create a percentage on how many immigrants can come into the United States. So in 1921, we have the Emergency Quota Act, which is going to be, the percentages are going to be based on the 1910 census. And then in 1924, Americans are going to strengthen that, and they're going to base immigration percentages on the 1890 census. Now both of these together, the Palmer Raids and the Quota Acts, the different percentages, are going to combine, like most historians will see this as a combination and that's going to be the Red Scare, okay, of 1920. Final way that nativism is going to manifest is the resurgence of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, yes, I did play around on the words. Okay? That's not actually how you spell Klux for the KKK, but you know. These are creating visuals for you to remember. And this is the KKK 2.0. And remember, 2.0, like, hates all of them. Everyone. African Americans, Jewish people, Catholics, any person of color, any kind of immigrant, anyone who is not white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. Alright? So that is nativism. Some more intolerance that's going to occur, we go up to this corner, is prohibition. Which was the 18th Amendment, right? And it was designed to decrease the amount of sin in America, but really all it did was increase crime, right? Now everyday Americans are breaking the law on the daily, and a lot of them go to a speakeasy. Get it? The guy, he speaks easy. Sorry. But also, not just everyday Americans, it leads to the increased influence, the growth of organized crime or the mob. Most notably, we have Al Capone. And this is where I'm like, you need to watch The Untouchables, which is all about the fight between Al Capone and Elliot Ness. Excellent movie. Also rated R. So if you can't watch rated R movies, you're going to have to wait. Alright. Another form of intolerance that's going to occur in the 1920s is fundamentalism. And this is going to be a direct reaction to science, because many fundamentalists believed in the literal translation of the Holy Bible, and because of that, they believed in the idea of creationism, which led to some major problems. All this fight came to a head, right? In the Scopes trial, in which Scopes taught evolution and broke the law. Okay? And then we're going to have the trial and the court case. We know all about that. One of the final intolerances that are going to really ramp up in the 1920s is racism. And it's going to come to the limelight because a lot of African Americans some of them will get behind the ideas of this guy named Marcus Garvey, who is an African American leader, and he's like, you know what, racism is never going to go away, white people are never going to accept us, we just need to return to Africa. And some people will. A lot of those people will come back. But some will stay there. And then others will stay here in America and fight the good fight against racism and against the KKK. Okay? Alright. Now, in case you can't read, That top word says innovations. So there are a ton of innovations. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is not just an innovation in productivity, really. So we have Fordism, which is an innovation in like economic productivity. But Fordism was the idea of really standardizing everything, perfecting the assembly line, making it more efficient. And this will actually enable Americans millions of Americans, lots of Americans, to be able to buy cars. Which leads to really, it leads to an increase in mobility. Okay. Second innovation I want to talk about is the radio. Which leads to the spread of American culture from coast to coast. Like even our accents become less differentiated. Like we still, of course, have the northeastern accents and the southern accents. But we all start to recognize the different accents and can understand them, and we all watch the same movies and listen to the same radio shows, and we all tune in to the same radio shows at the same time, which creates almost not necessarily a unified culture, because I wouldn't want to go that far, but definitely a cohesive culture. All right. Final invention is not really an invention. It's more just using an already existing invention in a new way. So we're going to have Lindbergh take the first transatlantic flight in the spirit of St. Louis, which will turn him into a great American hero. Okay. So we actually have innovative celebrities. Henry Ford is a celebrity, radio stars are celebrities, pilots are celebrities. People start to really recognize these various things. But then the 20s, they have to end. Okay? Roaring 20s are not so roaring, not really. And so, it leads to a lot of things that happen in the 20s lead to the Great Depression. So let's talk about the causes of the Great Depression. Of course, we have our stock market crash. On October 29th, 1929. Okay? Then, of course, we have tariffs, which basically shuts down global markets, sparking worldwide depression. We also have bank closures because of bank runs. And bankers start demanding money, and investors don't have it. Okay? Final cause is going to be the Federal Reserve, which I always just call the Fed. And they're going to restrict the money supply and raise interest rates. Okay? So those are the four major causes of the Great Depression. Now, how do we deal with the Great Depression? FDR gets elected. Hoover doesn't deal with it very well at all. Remember, we talked about rugged individualism and we talked about the idea that people should stop looking to the government for a handout. But at the same time, Hoover does make inroads into some of the, he paves the way for FDR to come through and actually implement the New Deal. But FDR goes about it a different way than Hoover would have. And one of the major differences between Hoover and FDR is that FDR will actually walk all over separation of powers. And what that means is he will actually, he'll disregard it. He'll start to do things he shouldn't do. Alright? One of the major ways that he walks all over the separation of power is this idea of the you can't really see that, can you? Is the court packing plan. In which he wants to increase the number of justices from 9 to potentially 15. And the reason he wants to do this is because the Supreme Court had been declaring New Deal programs unconstitutional. And they did that because they felt like the New Deal was FDR's attempt to put the federal government on steroids, or to bulk it up to such a way, to strengthen it in such a way that it would violate separation of powers and federalism in general. And it kind of did that, and we haven't really looked back since. And part of the reason why we allowed this to happen at the time is because, we were in the Great Depression, and FDR masterfully used media to his advantage. So the New Deal actually gained really popular backing because he used the radio and this thing he called fireside chats. Okay? And so let's go through his alphabet soup, and we'll start with reform. And reform they are the programs in the New Deal, in alphabet soup, that are the longest lasting programs, and they're designed to to actually prevent Depression-era problems again from ever happening again. Okay? So let's start with this first one. It's the Social Security Administration, which basically is pensions for the elderly, so that older people can retire, leave the workforce, and open up jobs for younger individuals. And they get this idea, it's based on Dr. Francis Townsend's okay. He's the one that really starts to come up with it. He's the one that really pushes it forward in his local area, in his state, in his community, and FDR sees this and he likes the idea, so he incorporates that into the New Deal. Another one of the more longer-lasting programs, or at least ideas, we've got the Tennessee Valley Authority. Otherwise known as the TVA, in which it sets the precedent of government-owned utilities that are usually cheaper and more efficient for consumers. So at this point we have handled the elderly. We've taken care of poor people who are without utilities because the TVA created a dam that created hydroelectricity and created government-owned electricity. And now, long-lasting reform within the financial sector is going to come in the form of the Glass-Steagall Act, which beefed up banks by creating deposit insurance and bank solvency, especially by creating the organization called the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures depositors' accounts up to a certain amount. The second thing we do in the financial sector is create the SEC, which is the Security and Exchange Commission, and it regulates and legitimizes the stock market. Okay. But the first thing really that needs to get done, now we're going to look at the second R, and that's going to be relief. Okay? And how FDR is going to use the New Deal to provide, he wants to try and help and provide immediate relief. And so what he does is he brings in a group of advisors that he will eventually call the Brain Trust. Okay? And these guys, these are some of the most intelligent guys in, engineering, in economics, in everything, in all different sectors of society and the economy, and he brings them together to try and figure out the best ways to help America. And one of the most notable advisors is going to be a man named John Maynard Keynes. Who creates an all-new way to look at fiscal policy. Based on the idea that demand is stronger than supply, which is going to completely change the approach to government involvement in the economy, and we legit have not looked back since. Like, it's never gone to pre-Great Depression involvement, ever. Although some people say it should. Okay? Now, other ways that we're going to provide some emergency relief is going to be the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, known as FARA. It's like a precursor to FEMA, by the way. Also notice they're not super original on their names. Alright, so let's talk about the Emergency Banking Relief Act. What it does is it shuts down, like we talked about the bank holiday earlier, but what it does is this act then goes through and it determines which banks, after they shut them all down, it takes a 4-day weekend or a 5-day weekend, and it determines which banks are still solvent, which banks are not. And they do this in an effort to prevent further loss of savings. Now, the FERA, what it's going to do is it's actually going to strengthen states. And how it does that is it provides direct aid to state governments, and then it actually creates bureaucracy within state governments, which I know some people are like, oh my god, that's horrible. But what it does is it creates jobs. Because if you create bureaucracy, you're creating jobs. So that's kind of the point. Alright. Final R we're going to look at is recovery. Now, recovery programs, these were programs that were specifically built to help the forgotten man which was like a campaign slogan for FDR. But there were programs built to help the forgotten man turn into the working man. And so one of the first programs that is going to do that, or one of the programs, not first necessarily, is the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was job creation for 18 to 25-year-old men. To rebuild rural area and public infrastructure. Another one is the Works Progress Administration. And technically this was job creation all over. So in urban centers, you had some examples would be like a street sweeper, or they hired artists. The WCA hired artists to actually create government-sponsored art, murals, street murals, installation pieces, you name it. In rural areas, they were used for building roads, dams. They were used as firemen. You name it. Whatever the rural area needed. And then this last one was the NRA, not the Rifle Association. This is the National Recovery Association. It's also the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Association. So this was job creation in industry, but it also increased job security. Oh, here. And job safety. It was like a big old union. Like a government-sponsored union. Okay. Alright, so overall, when you think of the Great Depression there, like if you walk away with nothing else, you need to walk away with the following information. Farmers are hit the hardest by the Great Depression. And it leads to a major population shift. So like we're gonna call them all Okies. Okies move to California. And that's due in part, really, in large part, to the Dust Bowl. And this story, this population shift, is shown in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. And the other thing that you really need to know about the Great Depression and the New Deal is that the New Deal, see Roosevelt dealing, provided minimal relief and recovery. But substantial reform, whether you see it as good or bad, for the Great Depression. And really, it's only World War II that will fully cure economic woes. So I hope this helps you to write a more thorough paper tomorrow, or to help you with the boom to bust test. Alright. Thanks, guys. Bye.